Welcome, everybody. Christina Wolf here, and this is another interview in the Discovering the Empowered Self interview series. It's a healing journey from early childhood trauma, and today I have with us Sama Morningstar. Welcome, Sama. Can you tell a little bit about yourself to our listeners and what you do and how you bring your gifts to the world?
Sure. Thank you, Christina. First of all, I want to just acknowledge you and thank you for doing such a wonderful topic and bringing so much awareness to this. I am a womb healing specialist, and I've learned over 20 years that I've been working with holistic healing for myself. Everything keeps pointing back to the womb. From my massage therapy practice, where I can trace with my regular clients chronic places of injury all the way back to what happened when they were in their mother's womb and when they were born, for example, that created a blueprint in their body that then they keep having recurring injuries to, early childhood trauma, or in my personally, as well as my womb awakening clients. We can trace patterns that are happening in our lives currently that might be disturbing, or that we would really like to change but seem to persist. The most persistent ones we can trace back to the origins, often in our mother's womb, experiences that our mothers had. And so it just keeps pointing back to this sacred space and development that happens inside our mother's womb, and the importance of addressing that, both in a collective way of we've got to change the structure of our society so that pregnant women are truly supported to have the kind of healthy pregnancy and life that supports them to truly nurture this child, but also for those of us who didn't have that and whose mothers were in distress or had horrible things happen to them while they were pregnant, to recognize how that is continuing to affect us and learn ways to go back and heal that through shamanic healing work and somatic healing work as well. So that's what my work is focusing on, is helping society at large to have a voice for the importance of this, and helping that change as people are awakening to this reality, how important that pregnancy and motherhood is for the health of our entire society, and also working with individuals for personal healing processes around that.
That is like beautiful. That's really such important work. It's like the idea of making sure that the soil is like nourishing before we plant the seed, basically. And I don't know if you've experienced this, but I have 3 children, and when I first got pregnant the very first time, I feel like I felt very vulnerable, and yet at the same time it created this sense of self in me that allowed me to finally stand up for myself because I was protecting another, if that makes sense.
Yeah.
So I think there's a transformation that takes place in mothers when they are pregnant. And just, I wanted to add to that too, in my police training, I don't know the exact statistic, but unfortunately, pregnant women are most at risk for family violence. For some reason, it triggers their partner, or I don't know the exact psychology behind it, but they're more, I don't know the exact 10 times at risk for being assaulted. You'd think that would be the time that they'd be most protected, and
well, there's a clue in what you just said before that about yourself, how when you were pregnant with your first child, suddenly you were sticking up for yourself more because now you are protecting another being inside of you, and that mothering instinct that activated inside of you. So I suspect that there are just as many women being assaulted who are not pregnant, but when they get pregnant, they're sticking up for themselves, which escalates the violence and possibly even makes them more likely to report that violence and
True.
land in the record books. So.
Mm-hmm. And you and I talked a little bit before we started recording about how the energy that your mother is in while you're in the womb creates like this basic blueprint for your own energetic identity, or if I'm saying that correctly. And it's funny because there were experiences my own mother had, and I think as I'm hearing about it later, like about her own domestic violence, her own sense of vulnerability. You know, my father tried to kidnap us after we were born, you know, so there was this overall feeling of, I think, stress and panic that my mother went through while she was divorcing this man. And, you know, during the course of her pregnancy, I think she was realizing energetically some things about him, you know, that he wasn't safe for us. And I think I absorbed that. And I don't know, you know, I didn't know until later on, like many details about her pregnancy with me. And it makes sense for why I am the way I am. She was forced to work while he stayed at home and didn't really work. And I have this feeling of like, oh, I have to work too much all the time. Like you inherit these generational wounds or like a core wound of some kind. Do you want to talk a little bit more about that?
Yeah, it's pretty well known and well documented that this is the case, that not only do we inherit, like you said, generational wounds where whatever trauma your mother went through throughout her entire life, that we, and your parents, both parents really, that we inherit that and still show signs of PTSD or post-traumatic stress, even if we grew up in a really healthy environment and non-traumatic environment, you know, that whatever trauma your parents experienced before you were even conceived gets passed down genetically, okay, to us. But then if there's a trauma that's happening specifically with your mother when she's pregnant with you, what happens is her stress hormones are bathing your little developing body in those stress hormones. And your body, as soon as you're conceived, starts absorbing and learning about the world that it's getting ready to be born into. And so it creates a body in response to that. Your genes, your genetic code is very much influenced by the environment that it's perceiving, that you're perceiving through your mother's body. And so different genetic expressions are turned more on and other genetic expressions are not turned on in response to that. So your whole body is being formed with that information, bathing it and surrounding it and infusing it with that. And so any big traumas that happen, or an overall sense of it's not safe here, like what you were talking about, which is the same kind of thing that I had, that becomes the blueprint for your life. But it's not just because you remember that. You don't remember it. Your brain wasn't even developed at that point. It's in the cells of your body. It's in your DNA. And that's why it's so hard to change some of these patterns. So, you know, what I discover in myself and with my clients is that oftentimes I understand, gosh, you know, I've created a safe life for myself. I have a husband that I can trust. I live in a community that, you know, all these things, but there are certain patterns that repeat themselves that don't seem to have anything to do with my current circumstances.
Yeah.
And no matter how much I understand, no matter how much spiritual practice or affirmations I do, I'm still producing cells in my body under that original blueprint. And so my body is still doing it that way,
Yeah.
no matter. And so I've learned that I needed to upgrade. It wasn't just a matter of understanding that I'm in a different circumstance now. There's a process of how do we get those genes that genetic imprint to shift. And that's a much deeper healing process. And so I've discovered that
that thing that you're talking about, that like getting to the deeper level, like that's what I think so many people struggle with, because they may have gone to talk therapy for like years and they're still like, it's still coming up. Mm-hmm. For me, it's because it's not a mental process. This trauma response, like I think what you're saying is like, you can actually be born in fight or flight, basically. You don't even know what a state of safety feels like, because your cells were bathed in that stress and that all those stress hormones. And so you're born literally in this trauma response. So you've never even known a sense of safety and calm, mm-hmm. and how to get out of that. Like, for you, you're just thinking, oh, well, I'm just not like everybody else. What is this mysterious, calm, safe feeling? I've never felt it, or it's a struggle to get there.
And it's interesting you bring that up, because the truth is, I don't think any of us have felt that. Anyone, anywhere. Even if they were born into a super healthy family, living in the world that we're in today. And there may be some different places on the continuum of how safe a person feels at a baseline, right? So somebody who grew up in an abusive family with drug addict parents and maybe some absentee parents, even whatever, on the streets, are going to have a much different baseline feeling of safety than someone who grew up in a healthy family with extended family that were all healthy and trying to. But even that family who have that, they're guaranteed they have generational trauma that maybe they've overcome, but that still is bringing that air. And not only that, but we have the environment of the world that we live in, where we can see now how the societal structures that we have established, the degradation of the environment and the war culture and all of these illnesses of patriarchy, are in our face right now in this world. And we're at this point of like, collectively, we have to do something different. And so in a sense, that fight and flight is justified.
Right. Yeah.
And at the same time, we need to be able to replenish ourselves by finding safety in order to heal. And that's the thing with somatic therapies, with talk therapy, where you're just remembering the traumatic event over and over again, and using whatever thinking techniques you can to change your behavior. It doesn't ever get you out of that nervous system.
I think it's sometimes, as you're talking and reliving it, you're creating stronger neural pathways to that memory, really.
Exactly. And so with the somatic therapies, the way they approach to actually weave new safety-oriented pathways, neural pathways, is to just barely come and touch the edge of where that trauma is held in the body, and breathe and release it a little bit, and keep returning to where there's pleasure and safety and where you feel that. So you go back and forth. It's called titration. And you go back and forth between feeling where there's pleasure, safety, calm, and then bringing that sensation to the edge of where there's stress, contraction, fear, and just touching and bringing that together. And pretty soon that evens out, and the fear is able to release from the body by giving it a safe space to be released. And so there's a different, a lot of healing modalities have said, okay, this fear-based, ego-based way of dealing with the world isn't working. We've got to dismantle that. We've got to take that apart, without nourishing our intrinsic, healthy, relaxed, calm, pleasure nature. And so if you don't nourish that, then all you're doing is you're trying to dismantle this broken way of being, is you're just breaking it more and more and more and re-traumatizing. So breaking down broken people doesn't create healthy, whole people.
Right. And I always say, like, what I like to do is teach people self-supporting habits to create the safe environment to explore your trauma, and give you like anchoring activities that, like, you know, when you're in the trauma response, it's kind of a dissociative state. You know, you're not in the here and now. And so if you learn how to be in the safe here and now, you can always return to that space, because you get what I guess they call that threshold of allowance, where it's just too much. And then you start dissociating again. Like, this is too much.
Right. That dissociation has been a powerful ally for many people who grew up, who, you know, started out with trauma in utero, and it was trauma the whole time. Gosh, it doesn't feel safe to be here at all. And so our psyche, our awareness, and our consciousness and our spirit just completely goes outside of the body. And this culture that we live in is a trauma-based culture, and values people that are dissociated from their bodies, as we can see by looking at people who are in positions of political power in our world right now. Oftentimes it's very obvious that they have completely no connection with the physical body or the environment, or, you know, the world, the earth.
Being in the here and the now.
Yeah. And so people are valued who can completely dissociate, get into their intellect.
Yeah.
You know, and have no connection with the here and now in the body. And so a lot of my treatments and therapies are to really connect with the body, because the body has intrinsic healing capacities that naturally release the traumatic residue and get back to a state of homeostasis and peace and calm and wellness, and can give us a feeling of things being right in the world, if we connect and allow ourselves to go through the process of that, which often involves things that are considered that are sort of disallowed in our culture, right? It involves feeling emotions that are taboo or not sanctioned. It involves feeling grief and anger and feeling our darkness, the things that we're taught to avoid feeling. Mm-hmm. It involves making embarrassing sounds and movements potentially that are not considered cool or okay. You know, people who are recovering from trauma, who go through a trauma release, they might cry, they might wail, they might moan, they might shake, they might move around, they might scream. Their body is going through a natural process, and it's not under our intellectual control, because our intellect doesn't know how to do that and has been trained to not go anywhere near those kinds of experiences. So,
well, and we've been taught to suppress for so long, and there's in my experience, very few spaces to allow that process to take place.
Yeah.
And if people fear it, they're like, oh, no, she's getting out of control. Let's stop it. And, especially, my working with severely mentally ill people who are incarcerated, as soon as they started having a trauma response or really acting out or whatnot, becoming violent or screaming or wailing, the nurses, it was their immediate concern to control them, calm them, whatever, because it could potentially lead to them be self-harming. And, it's our society does not value, like you say, feelings. It's not considered good data. It's not considered measurable. or it's to be what's the word, for lack of a better term, devalued. Like, this is just based on your feelings. That's not important. What you really think and your rational thought is the only thing that matters. Mm-hmm. But a lot of this trauma is encoded in your body from a feeling place.
Well, and that's the thing. You've made a distinction there where we only value rational thought in this society. We're taught to only value rational thought. Well, rational thought comes from a very small portion of the brain, the front brain, okay? And 90% of the brain is in the hind brain, okay? And we're taught to devalue everything that comes from the hind brain. So emotions, sensory experiences, and these types of healing processes, dream experiences, imagination, creativity, all of that comes from the hind brain. In some circles in the womb awakening work that I do, we talk about that as the feminine brain and cerebellar consciousness. So that's 90% of our capacity that we're just devaluing.
And cutting ourselves off from.
Cutting ourselves off from all of the extrasensory experiences that people have, psychic abilities.
They're saying, oh, you're woo-woo or something.
And that is...
I intuitively know things, and,
right.
It's just not valued to say that. And I'm like, I've gotten better at saying, I don't really care what you think. I don't need statistics to back this up. I know this to be true.
And that is the systematic devaluing and oppression of the feminine that is the foundation of patriarchal society.
Patronizing?
Yeah, exactly. All of that. And so my work is all about, let's get back in touch with and start to align ourselves with that feminine hind brain, feminine consciousness that values all of these ways of being, that allows for this healing of trauma and disallows the perpetuating of trauma. That's the thing. It's the separation between the sort of the masculine and feminine ways of being,
which we all have. We have both. Yeah.
We have both. But that rift and the domination, the domination of masculine over feminine, that is the cause of all of this trauma. As you could see by what we talked about at the beginning, where women are treated violently by their partners, by their male partners primarily, and not the other way around.
Now, how would you get into the body? If you're so disconnected in your head, what do you recommend to get into the body that feels safe? Because I think a lot of us are numb and we fear getting into the body because we're going to start feeling and knowing a lot of data we didn't want to address.
Right. So the first thing I start with my students and my clients is breathing. So just simply noticing your natural breath and feeling the sensations of your breath. We can do it a little bit now if you like.
Sure. Yeah. And it's funny. I was saying, grief is where held in the lungs, right? And so if you're having a lot of trauma and a lot of grief, chances are you're not fully taking deep breaths, and it stays there. You develop pneumonia, you develop COPD. These are like chronic illnesses that when they did that ACEs study through Kaiser Permanente, they said even if you did not have toxic habits like smoking, if you had multiple ACEs or adverse childhood experiences, you were more likely to develop some kind of lung disorder. And I really strongly believe it has to do with the fact that you hold that grief in your lungs,
right,
basically.
And so it stands to makes sense that we can release that grief from our lungs too.
Mm-hmm.
And breathing is one of the most powerful ways to release grief and trauma, not only physically from the lungs and from the body, but also emotionally and spiritually as well. Spiritual practitioners have been using breathing and breathing meditations, various different ways of breathing, to achieve different spiritual states, and healing practitioners have been using breathing since the beginning of time. And so the first thing that we can begin with for someone who's new to this, but it's something that I come back to time and time again, is simply feeling your natural breath, bringing your awareness to your natural breath. It's a powerful meditation at any moment in time. Simply noticing your natural breath.
It's kind of an anchoring thing, like I'm in the here and now, like bring me back into my body, you know.
And it physically brings you into your body, because as you notice that inhale, the air is passing into your body. Your consciousness is passing into your body and down into your lungs and into all of your cells. Because as that air passes into your lungs, the oxygen, the lungs do their job and sends that nourishment, that life force into the cells of your body. And then that natural exhale, you can feel a natural relaxation and release of whatever toxins or energies. That's happening all the time. If it weren't, you'd be dead.
And it's really simple. Like it's a very easy practice to do.
It is.
It just requires your consciousness, your conscious ability to bring your attention to that.
Right. And it's the one of our, we have bodily functions that we supposedly don't have a whole lot of control over. For example, digestion or the beating of your heart. Now, but breathing, we can decide, anyone can decide, I'm going to take a deep breath now. Now, it might be more difficult for some than others. Like if you're in the fit of a crying fit and you're totally freaking out about something, it might be really difficult to take a deep breath. But I tell you what, if you are in that fit and somebody tells you, okay, take a deep breath with me, and they stick with you and they help you and guide you to take a deep breath, or you're able to do that for yourself, that's going to immediately change your panic.
Mm-hmm. And even if you hyperventilate to the point that you pass out, your breathing then goes into the automatic calmer state.
Right. And that automatically takes place, but we can choose to do that for ourselves at any time.
Mm.
And that's very different than, say, if your heartbeat is racing. Well, you can calm your heartbeat down, but how do you do it? By choosing to breathe more slowly.
Right.
And that's what calms your heart rate down. Or, for example, if your digestion is cramping up and just all tied up in knots, you know how I heal that? First thing I tell people to do, first thing I do for myself, I stop and I breathe deeply. And that calms down the digestion.
Mm. And then, and then women who are in birth, they control their breathing to control the pain. So
they find ways of breathing that helps them to cope with the pain.
So do you want to add anything else about your somatic work?
Well, so the somatic work helps to release the stored up trauma from the body, okay? And helps to reorient our nervous system and our felt experience towards pleasure, okay? Which is wonderful at rewiring our whole system and our whole blueprint. There's also a deeper, well, I wouldn't say deeper, but something that we can do that goes with that can help to rewire even more aspects of how our genetics are continuing to build our lives. I can't, I don't like to say more or less. It goes hand in hand. It's a different aspect of it.
Enhances it, basically.
Enhances it and accesses more areas and integrates it more into all aspects of our life. And that is shamanic work. Okay.
Right.
So when you go to one of my yoga classes, for example, I'm giving you suggestions of breathing. The tone of my voice is giving you suggestions. I'm inviting you to make sounds, which is another aspect of that breathing, which starts to bring it into the shamanic work. The sound is, the vibration of sound is then also vibrating our cells and helping our cells to rewire to a place of wellness, and our whole systems to do that. I'm inviting you to move, which is helping the body to give it space to release the trauma and the tension somatically through the movement. I'm also making suggestions of moods or what to do with memories that might arise. So as we get involved somatically in this way, what we might discover is, as we're breathing into our lungs, there's grief that comes up. And we might discover that, oh my gosh, why am I remembering that time when such and such happened?
Mm.
And that memory may have been stored in there. And so then what do we do with that memory? Okay, so we release it. But what I've discovered in my shamanic healing work is that, okay, so we release it, we breathe, we grieve, we let go of that. But then sometimes it's still in there. And what I've discovered is that if we can bring a healing awareness, a healing consciousness to that, and give that wounded part of ourselves, say something happened when we were a small child, that scared little girl in there, if I can give that scared little girl the mothering that she didn't get in that moment, when that memory comes up, I can arrive there shamanically as the wise woman that I am today. And I can bring spirit allies and ask for the support of spirit allies to that moment with that scared little girl. And suddenly that rewires that part of me that still responds as that scared little girl. We can do the same thing with what happened inside our mother's womb when we were developing. I just had a session like that recently for myself, where and in telling this part of the story, it'll show how, and I'll be brief, because things that happen when we're in our mother's womb can repeat themselves throughout our lives. So I recently found out that I was being sued, and I was going in for a deposition. A piece of furniture fell on a client in one of my classes, and in one of my yoga classes. It was horrible, and so it turns out I was going in for a deposition. When I told this to my mother said, "Oh, I went to a deposition when I was pregnant with you."
Mm.
Okay.
Wow.
So I'm like, whoa, how could this be repeating? I mean, the freak accident was like, how could this be happening, Michael? And then this happened with my mother when she was pregnant with me. Well, so I said, all right, I need to go back to that moment and heal this when she was pregnant with me. So we went back there and brought the wise woman that I am now to that moment of where I was developing when she went to that deposition. And that started to rewire things and reorient how I relate to this whole process. Wow. And so we can do that shamanically by revisiting. And we can even go farther back in ancestry and get into ancestral healing. At a certain point, I was working with my mother on some of this, and she was working with a fear pattern that was very persistent. And we traveled back to her great grandmother when she was 3 years old, and something that happened to her then, and brought the wise women that we are now to that scared 3-year-old of her great grandmother, and things started to shift and change and like that. So the shamanic work can begin to combine with the somatic releasing work and somatic healing work to bring healing to these layers upon layers of trauma that we're working with, and help our blueprint to revise itself and to come into a place where we're creating more wellness as our cells reproduce themselves in new ways and make new pathways.
Well, thank you so much for all of those wonderful insights. I wonder, how can our listeners find you outside of this interview series?
Yeah, they can reach me through my website at samamorningstar.com. And I actually have a free gift available on the homepage of that website of an excerpt from my recently released poetry book called Goddesses, Lovers, and Dreams. And this poetry has been an important part of my shamanic healing process. And so this book demonstrates how writing in this way, accessing the cerebellar, the feminine consciousness, and writing poetry can help in the healing process. So that's another aspect that I bring to my healing work, is the writing in that way. So you can get a free excerpt and get on my newsletter there when you sign up for that excerpt at samamorningstar.com.
That's wonderful. Thank you so much for joining us and sharing all that. I mean, already just talking with you, I feel so much calmer and gentle. And, you know, it's like when you have this immediate stress in your body, just breathing, that's the one takeaway I think our listeners will love. So thank you once again for your time and for sharing. And we will come back for another interview later. So bye for now, everyone. Thanks for being with us, Sama.
Thanks for having me.
Bye.